Good evening, dear friends. Thank you for sharing another winter night with me. Your company always warms the room. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? There's something special about December evenings. The hush after the last carol, the softness of cold air settling outside the window. And tonight, in that quiet, one missing voice will unravel a secret, long protected. The church hall glowed softly under rows of winter lamps. Warm light pooled on the wooden floor, turning everything gentle, steady, familiar. It was the sort of evening street. Mary Mead understood well quiet voices, careful footsteps, and the soft rustle of music sheets in mittened hands. Miss Marple sat near the cast-iron stove, mending a pale blue mitten. Her needles clicked in a slow, comforting rhythm. She never hurried such things. Old wool, she believed, responded better to patience than to speed. Around her, the villagers prepared for the winter choir festival. Scarves hung on chair backs. Hymn books lay open on the front table. A kettle steamed faintly in the corner, filling the room with the thin scent of peppermint. It was all rather pleasant. Mrs. Bantry fluttered beside the choir risers, adjusting a candle lantern with dramatic precision. "Jane," she whispered loudly, "do brace yourself for Arthur's singing. He is absolutely convinced he was a baritone in a previous life." Colonel Bantry, overhearing, gave a good-natured harumph from across the room. "I'll have you know," he said, "my voice has fine military discipline." Mrs. Bantry winked. Exactly the problem. Miss Marple smiled to herself. These little exchanges warmed her almost as much as the stove. They meant the village was at ease, as it should be on a winter evening. But one man in the room was not at ease. Mr. Rummin, Alfred Penrose, choir director, new resident, quiet man with a careful manner, kept glancing at the hall's front door. Not casually, not absent-mindedly. No, he looked with expectation. And each time the door remained still, a faint tightening crossed his face. Miss Marple saw it at once. She always did notice such things. Small reactions, slight pauses, the sort of changes most people dismissed without a thought. Her needles slowed, then stopped entirely. Penrose lifted a sheet of music, but his fingers trembled slightly at the edge. A man preparing to conduct should be calm, but his hands seemed restless, unsettled. He rubbed them together as if cold, yet the stove was warm, and no one else complained of a chill. Mrs. Bantry leaned close again. "He's a peculiar one, isn't he? Pleasant enough. But I do wonder why he avoids conversation unless cornered." Miss Marple nodded mildly, her gaze fixed on Penrose's cuff. There, very small, almost hidden, was a faint smudge of soot, not the sort one acquired from the stove. This was darker, finer, the sort that clung to objects long forgotten or long undisturbed. She considered this quietly. People carried stories on their clothing more often than they realized. A thread here, a stain there, a button sewn in haste instead of care. And tonight, soot on a cuff. Penrose looked toward the door again quickly, this time, sharply. Still no one entered. Still nothing changed. But Miss Marple felt a shift. Not visible. Not loud. Just present. A soft uneasiness settled inside her, quiet but persistent. Something in the hall's comfortable order had moved. Not enough for the others to sense. Enough only for her. She returned to her mitten, though her mind remained elsewhere. And as the lamps glowed and the choir hummed their first warm-up notes, Miss Marple thought gently, thoughtfully, but something felt slightly wrong. The rehearsal drifted into a calm rhythm. Voices rose. Voices settled. A few children whispered in the back, earning gentle shushes from Mrs. Clement. The stove gave a small pop as the iron shifted in the heat. Everything felt settled, almost overly settled, like the room had wrapped itself in a winter blanket. Then a sound broke it. A small, bright sound. Clear, unmistakable. A bell. The little brass bell from the hall's storage room. It rang once. A single sharp note, then silence. Several villagers turned their heads. Mrs. Bantry blinked. Colonel Bantry lowered his hymn book. Lucy paused mid-step. But no one moved toward the sound. It wasn't loud, just unexpected. Miss Marple's needles stilled in her lap. They did not clatter. They simply stopped, suspended between one stitch and the next. Her eyes lifted. Not hurriedly, not dramatically. Just a soft, steady motion, born from years of noticing what others overlooked. Across the hall, Mr. Alfred Penrose stiffened, not visibly to everyone, but unmistakably to her. His back straightened a fraction. His fingers tightened around the baton. His eyes widened quickly before he caught himself and forced his expression still again. Miss Marple watched him with quiet attention. A bell in an empty room meant very little to most people. A draft, a fallen object, some accidental shift. But people did not stiffen at accidents. Not like that. Penrose swallowed, a small, tense motion in his throat. He looked toward the storage room door, then quickly away. Miss Marple's gaze followed his brief glance. The door was closed. The lamps along the hall cast a soft glow on its brass handle. Nothing moved. No shadows. No footsteps. Just the faint creak of the wooden ceiling settling. Yet Penrose had reacted as if the sound carried meaning. A memory, perhaps, or a warning. She tapped her needle lightly against her thumb, a habit she had when her mind began to arrange things. Small things, minor details, pieces that did not fit neatly yet, but would. Mrs. Bantry leaned close. Odd, wasn't it? She whispered. Wind, maybe? Or one of the children? Wandering where they shouldn't. Miss Marple nodded gently. Yes, perhaps. But her tone suggested something else entirely. She had lived long enough to know that disturbances rarely entered a quiet room without reason. Her eyes drifted back to Penrose. He had resumed rehearsal. Or rather, he pretended to. He lifted his baton. He cleared his throat. He instructed the altos to begin again. But his rhythm had changed. His gestures were slightly sharper, tighter. A man trying to appear composed. A man who feared being watched. A man waiting for a door to open. Or for someone not to enter at all. Miss Marple folded her mending gently. The bell still echoed in her thoughts. That is rather curious, she murmured, barely audible. Something small had shifted in the warm hall. Something subtle, something easy to miss. But she felt it. Quiet as snow. Something was beginning. The moment the altos began again, the calm inside the hall cracked. A hurried whisper rose. Then another. Then three voices speaking over one another, all uneasy. Someone near the risers dropped a lantern. The glass shattered softly across the wooden floor. Mrs. Clement gasped and pressed a hand to her chest. The children stopped singing. Their eyes drifted toward the back door. I saw something. One boy breathed. A shadow. Right there, just now. The room buzzed with overlapping voices. Warm lamps flickered. Scarves rustled. Music sheets fluttered from startled hands. Miss Marple remained seated by the stove. Her posture never changed. Her needles rested quietly in her lap, but her eyes were sharp. Mr. Penrose was gone, vanished between one note and the next. 10 minutes passed. No one had seen him leave. Lucy stood near the front row, trembling. Her fingers twisted the edge of her shawl. Miss Marple approached with her gentle, measured step. "Are you quite all right, dear?" she asked softly. Lucy nodded too quickly. "Just startled," she whispered, but her eyes avoided the door. And her voice carried fear, not surprise. The villagers searched the hall in small, nervous groups. Chairs were moved. Drawers opened. Lanterns lifted to brighter angles, but nothing explained the shadow. Nothing explained Penrose's sudden absence. Miss Marple bent slowly to pick up something near her chair, a folded scrap of music paper. Very small, torn neatly at the edge. She opened it with careful fingers. Inside was a single note circled in red. A thin, deliberate mark. Not accidental, not careless, intentional. She studied it for a long, quiet moment. Voices swirled around her. Footsteps crossed hurriedly. Someone insisted the shadow had moved twice, but Miss Marple focused only on the circle. A message, perhaps. A warning, possibly. Or something placed for someone who never arrived. She folded the paper again, slipped it into her knitting bag, closed the clasp with a soft click. Patterns, she murmured. They always begin quietly. She looked toward the door once more. The lamps flickered again, almost knowingly. A hush settled again as the villagers drifted into smaller clusters, each person speaking in lowered tones, as if afraid to disturb something fragile in the air. Miss Marple moved slowly across the hall, her shoes soft against the wooden floor, noting every expression, every whisper, every unsettled glance. Someone closed the curtains. Someone checked the latch twice. And somewhere in that uneasy shuffle, she felt a story forming thin, delicate, but undeniably present, waiting for its moment to step forward. She knew the hall was holding its breath for truth to come. She knew the pattern had begun. Rumors in Street Mary Mead never walked. They ran. They slipped between chairs, drifted through lamplight, and curled into corners faster than steam from the kettle. And tonight was no different. Before the choir even settled again, Mrs. Bantry leaned toward Mrs. Clement with a conspiratorial whisper. "I heard Penrose argued with the organist last week, quite loudly, near the vestry door." Mrs. Clement gasped softly, almost delighted by the drama. "Mrs. Fielding never liked him taking charge," she muttered. "Never," Mrs. Bantry agreed, too proud to hand the choir to a newcomer. Within minutes, the rumour spread across the hall. One person repeated it to two more. Two told six. Voices grew confident, faces sharpened with certainty. Mrs. Fielding became the centre of every glance. She stood by the organ bench, adjusting her sheet music with stiff hands. Her limp slowed her movements. Her jaw tightened each time someone looked her way. It was clear she sensed the shift in the room. Colonel Bantry puffed up his chest. "Really, someone ought to question her," he declared. "Bad business. Quarrels. Bad business altogether. Mrs." Fielding's voice trembled as she adjusted her spectacles. "I did not argue," she insisted quietly. "I simply reminded Mr. Penrose that tradition matters. We have sung these pieces for years. Change comes slowly in a village." But her defense only fed suspicion. Some villagers stepped back. Others nodded knowingly. A few even whispered the word revenge. It all seemed so convincing. Too convincing. Miss Marple watched in thoughtful silence. She never judged quickly. Not when human nature remained the most complicated thread in any pattern. She approached Mrs. Fielding with a gentle smile. "My dear, are you all right?" Mrs. Fielding exhaled shakily. "I am tired, Miss Marple. That is all." But Miss Marple wasn't watching her face. She was watching her feet, her gait, her careful steps, her slow turn of the ankle. And then she saw it something everyone else had forgotten. The storage room, the door's location, the narrow back walkway. Mrs. Fielding could not have reached it unseen. Not with her limp, not with her slow movement, not with the choir clustered near the risers. Miss Marple folded her hands over her mending bag. "A curious thing," she said softly. "Stories travel faster than truth." Lucy approached, pale and unsettled. "The Colonel wants to organize a search," she whispered. "For what he doesn't say. But he insists the organist knows something." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, dear. Mrs. Fielding has troubles, yes, but not this one." The gossip swelled again. A dozen voices arguing. A dozen conclusions formed from thin winter air. Miss Marple moved through the noise like a quiet thread stitching order into confusion. Her steps careful, her mind sharper than ever. Because she had seen the flaw, the small, simple detail buried under rumor. She had seen something everyone else had forgotten. The gossip grew louder, swirling like a restless winter draft around the hall. Voices tangled, accusations sharpened. Everyone seemed certain of something different. But none of it felt solid. Not to Miss Marple. She gathered her mending and stepped toward the refreshment table for a moment of quiet. A cup of warm tea often helped one think. Steam curled gently from the spout. The peppermint scent eased the noise in her mind. That was when Lucy appeared beside her, not walking, not calling her name, just appearing, pale as frost, fingers trembling at the edge of her shawl. Miss Marple, she whispered, a soft whisper, barely more than breath. May I speak privately? Miss Marple turned with her usual calm smile. Of course, dear. Let us step just over here. The kettle is noisy enough to offer us a little privacy. They moved a few paces aside, behind a stack of hymn books on the side table. Lucy looked around nervously, making sure no one watched. Her eyes darted toward the back door, then away. Her breath shook. I shouldn't say anything, she began. It isn't my place, and I promised. Myself, I wouldn't get involved. Miss Marple folded her hands patiently. Sometimes, dear, involvement finds us, whether we seek it or not. Lucy swallowed hard. I saw Mr. Penrose last night, she whispered. Behind the church, near the old stone path. I was carrying lanterns back after rehearsal. It was dark, and I didn't want to interrupt. Miss Marple nodded gently. Go on. They weren't alone, Lucy said. There was someone with him, someone in a dark winter coat, hood pulled low. I could not see the face, but they were arguing. Her voice wavered. It wasn't a small argument. It was tense, like something old and dangerous was being opened again. Miss Marple's expression remained soft, almost kind, but her eyes sharpened with quiet interest. What did you hear? She asked. Lucy hesitated, hands tightening, breath hitching. Only one sentence, she whispered finally, but it frightened me so badly, I nearly dropped the lantern. Miss Marple waited without pressing. The words came out like a fragile thread. You promised never to return. Miss Marple felt a subtle shift inside her, a familiar sensation, the feeling of a pattern adjusting, realigning, revealing new edges. Did you recognize the voice? She asked softly. Lucy's gaze fell to the floor. Her lips tightened, a small shake of her head. I can't say, she murmured. Or maybe I won't. Not yet. I'm afraid of being wrong, or right. Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on her arm. There is no rush, dear. Fear often clouds certainty, and certainty grows best when treated gently. Lucy nodded gratefully, though fear still pressed behind her eyes. When she walked away, Miss Marple remained still for a long, thoughtful moment. The hall buzzed with noise again, but her mind was already turning, quietly, steadily, as only hers could. The argument, the shadow, the missing man, the circled note, the soot on the cuff, and now, a promise broken. She exhaled softly. A piece of the truth had shifted. The next morning arrived quietly. Soft frost clung to the churchyard grass. The lamps inside Street Mary Mead's hall glowed with a sleepy dimness, still warming from the early hour. Villagers drifted in with scarves wrapped high, ready for another rehearsal. But one person did not come. Mr. Alfred Penrose. At first it seemed harmless. A delayed start, a missed kettle. The winter roads were slick after all. But 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 30. Mrs. Clement wrung her hands. He is never late, she murmured. Colonel Bantry puffed impatiently. Man should take punctuality seriously, he grumbled, though even he looked uneasy. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, not rushed, not alarmed, just quietly attentive. A choir boy ran in breathlessly from outside. His coat! He cried. It's by the churchyard gate! A hush fell. Villagers exchanged glances, nervous, uncertain. Coats were gathered, boots tightened. A small search party formed near the hall entrance. Miss Marple followed with calm steps, her eyes tracing the frost, the prints, the tiny details others stepped over. At the churchyard gate, Penrose's coat hung crookedly from the old iron latch. One sleeve dangled, torn. Miss Marple leaned closer. A patch of the fabric was snagged on a rusty nail ripped cleanly away, as if caught during a hurried struggle. Mrs. Bantry shivered. Oh my goodness, was there a fight? Colonel Bantry crouched near the ground. Footprints, he said. Fresh. Miss Marple saw them too. 2 sets, one firm and steady, the other dragged. The prince veered off the main path, crossing the frozen grass toward the vicarage. Halfway there, the prince changed, becoming a long, unbroken drag mark, as though one person no longer walked upright. Lucy gasped softly. Her hands flew to her mouth. "I told you something was wrong." "I knew it." Miss Marple placed a hand on her shoulder. "Calm. Steady. Breadth of breath, dear. We must look carefully." The trail led to the small woodshed behind the vicarage. Its door stood slightly ajar, creaking faintly in the morning breeze. Colonel Bantry pushed it open. Inside, dust hung in the cold air like powder. Old tools leaned against the walls. Lantern hooks rusted with age. But on the floor, near a stack of firewood, something bright caught Miss Marple's eye. A music folder. Penroses. Dropped in haste. Pages splayed across the dirt. A few were crumpled, torn at the edges, as though stepped on. Mrs. Clement let out a trembling breath. Where is he? Where did he go? What happened? The villagers filled the doorway, wide eyes, anxious whispers, disbelief forming in murmured tones. Miss Marple stepped forward into the shed, slowly, purposefully. Her skirts brushing the dusty floor, she knelt beside the scattered music sheets. Her fingers hovered over a torn corner, her gaze narrowing with quiet intensity. The rhythm of the hall, the warmth of lamps, the whispers of yesterday, they all faded. Her voice fell to a gentle, certain whisper. This was no accident. Miss Marple left the woodshed with a quiet, steady breath. The villagers clustered behind her, voices rising in anxious threads, but she did not stay to join them. There was something she needed. Silence, winter, and the long church path beneath her feet. So she walked. The morning air was calm, holding that crisp stillness winter often brought to Street Mary Mead. Soft snow cracked faintly under her steps. Frost edged the stone walls like lace. The church tower rose quietly beside her, collecting the pale light of the sky. She walked with her hands gently clasped, not hurried, not worried, just thoughtful. As she moved, her mind began its careful work sorting, weighing, setting small pieces of the world into their rightful places. The soot on Penrose's cuff. Such a small thing. Yet such things often whispered the loudest. The bell in the storage room. No one inside. Yet someone knew it would ring. Lucy's fear. Real fear. Not imagined. Not exaggerated. A fear born from something seen, or heard, or remembered too clearly. The circled music note. Folded. Hidden. Deliberate. Not a simple slip of paper, but a message, though, for whom remained the question. Miss Marple paused near the stone bench by the church doorway. She brushed a bit of snow from the seat, but she did not sit. She looked at the faint drag mark on the frosted grass behind the vicarage, just visible from her vantage point. Then she looked toward the hall. Two worlds, two directions, two sets of intentions shaping the same winter morning. Penrose's disappearance did not feel like a single moment. It felt like a continuation, something old walking back into the present. She resumed her gentle walk, the cold wrapping around her shawl like a familiar companion. Who would silence a choir director? Who would confront him behind a church? Who would wait until the hall was filled with voices, then slip into darkness? A jealous colleague? No. Mrs. Fielding's limp denied her involvement. The rumor made noise, not sense. A villager with a grievance? Perhaps, but none strong enough to create this chain of actions. A stranger? Possible, yet unlikely. Strangers rarely leave such personal marks. No, this was someone with history in their pocket, someone Penrose recognized, someone he feared, and yet someone he expected. A contradiction. But contradictions were not confusing to Miss Marple. They were illuminating. She reached the old lich gate and rested her hand lightly against its wooden frame. Her eyes narrowed not sharply but gently, the way one narrows their gaze when reading a small stitch in dim light. Fear and expectation. A man looking at the door again and again. A message circled in red, a bell ringing at a precise moment. Penrose had not been taken by surprise. He had been answering something, or someone. Miss Marple drew a slow breath. A new direction unfolded in her thoughts, simple and clear as a fresh winter path. She knew where to look next. Miss Marple had just reached the lich gate when she heard soft footsteps behind her. Light, hesitant, the kind children made when they weren't sure if they should speak. She turned gently. Little Peter Briggs stood a few paces away, cap in hand, boots dusted with frost. His cheeks were red from the cold. His eyes, wide and troubled, shifted between Miss Marple and the churchyard path. He took a step forward, then stopped again, tiny breaths curling in the winter air. "Miss Marple," he said softly. She smiled, warm and steady. "Yes, dear?" He looked over his shoulder, making sure no adults were near. When he seemed satisfied, he came closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "I saw something last night," he said, "near the woodshed." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle, inviting, never pressing. Children, she knew, unfolded truth like delicate paper, slowly, carefully, with fear of tearing something important. "What did you see, Peter?" she asked. He swallowed. "I saw two men." Miss Marple waited. Not a flicker of surprise, just patience. "One of them was Mr. Penrose," Peter continued. "I'm sure. He had the same hat, and he kept rubbing his hands the way he always does when he's nervous." Miss Marple nodded. "That fits very well, dear. And the other?" Peter looked down at the snow, then back up, voice even softer. "He was wearing a church verger's coat." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "The vicar's verger." Peter shook his head quickly. "No, the vicar's coat is old, faded, long. This one was newer and shorter. It didn't fit right, like it belonged to someone else." Miss Marple felt the first quiet spark of certainty move through her thoughts. Misfitted clothing, disguises, borrowed authority. Peter went on, gaining a little confidence as he spoke. "The second man had something shiny in his hand," he said. "I couldn't see what it was. It caught the lantern light. Maybe a key, or a small lantern, or some kind of badge." Miss Marple pictured it winter light glinting off metal, reflecting against frost, revealing the smallest truth to the smallest observer. "And what were they doing?" she asked gently. Peter hesitated. They were talking, arguing. Mr. Penrose sounded scared. He shifted again, boots crunching softly, but the other man sounded angry. Really angry. He kept pointing the shiny thing at Mr. Penrose, like he was warning him. Miss Marple placed a gloved hand on his shoulder. "You were very brave to tell me, Peter." He nodded, though uncertainty still clouded his small features. "Do you think Mr. Penrose is all right?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Her mind worked in calm, deliberate circles, pulling threads together. The soot, the bell, the coat, the circled note, the argument, the shadow, and now, a second man dressed in borrowed authority. A line connected, a shape formed, a truth stepped quietly into place. And suddenly, Miss Marple whispered to herself, the whole picture turned. Miss Marple remained near the lich gate, long after little Peter Briggs hurried back toward the village green. She did not move quickly. She simply stood in the quiet winter air, letting the pieces settle. Silence often revealed more than sound. And now, something old stirred in her memory. A name. A story whispered years ago over tea at a neighboring parish. A scandal no one wanted printed in a newsletter, but everyone discussed behind closed curtains. 10 years ago, a choir director dismissed in shame. The phrase used at the time was delicate financial irregularities. A polite way of saying funds had vanished, books had been altered, collections had gone missing, and trust, once broken, never truly returned. The director's name was Alfred Penrose. Miss Marple folded her hands against the chill, eyes narrowing with gentle focus. Yes, she remembered it clearly now. The quiet dismissal, the polite explanations, the swift departure to another parish far enough away to dull the echoes of gossip. But there had been more to it. Not in the official accounts, of course those were always tidied with careful language. She recalled another detail, a whispered one. Alfred had not acted alone. There had been a partner in those misdeeds. Someone close, someone trusted, someone whose betrayal cut deeper, because betrayal always strikes hardest from familiar hands. Thomas Penrose, Alfred's brother. Miss Marple could almost hear Mrs. Weatherby, from Much Wellham, speaking the words over a plate of seed. Cake. They quarrelled, Jane, terribly, voices raised behind the vestry, and after that night, Thomas disappeared. No forwarding address, no explanation, just gone. Gone, yes, until now. Miss Marple's breath fluttered softly in the cold air. The pattern grew clearer, thread by thread. A returning brother, an old quarrel unresolved, a partnership built on secrecy and broken by guilt, and a man like Alfred, living quietly in a new village, carrying a past he hoped would remain buried. But the past had come back. She thought of the soot on Alfred's cuff. Not from the hall stove, not from daily tasks. No soot from the old vestry stove, the one used years ago to burn documents, letters, ledgers, evidence. Perhaps he had gone there recently. Perhaps someone else did. She thought of the circled music note, a simple symbol. Yet symbols carried meaning, especially between two brothers who once communicated through coded markings in their shared compositions. Only the Penrose brothers used such signals, a circled note, a silent bell, a returned shadow in a verger's coat, a shiny object reflecting lantern light, a voice saying, "You promised never to return." Old guilt resurfacing, old debt resurfacing, old wrongdoing resurfacing. And now, something had inflamed it. Something sharp enough to pull Thomas out of whatever darkness he had been hiding in. Miss Marple touched the lich-gate gently, her gloved fingers brushing the cold wood. The village believed this was a new mystery, but she saw it differently. This was the end of an old one finally stepping into the light. The winter afternoon settled over Street, Mary Mead like a soft blanket, dimming the edges of the village and quieting the wind. Inside the church hall, Miss Marple asked for a small gathering, nothing dramatic, nothing official. Just a few people she trusted to listen carefully. Colonel Bantry was the first to arrive, scarf hanging crookedly from his coat. Mrs. Clement followed, clutching her notebook as though holding a hymn against the cold. Lucy slipped in quietly, shawl wrapped tight, eyes still shadowed by worry. The verger arrived with hesitant steps, hands folded neatly in front of him, and Constable Pork, slightly out of breath, took the last chair with an apologetic nod. Miss Marple sat at the centre table, her knitting settled on her lap. The soft colours of the wool calmed the room. She didn't rush. She never did. "Thank you for coming," she said gently. "There are certain matters we must consider together." Colonel Bantry leaned forward. "Found something, have you, Miss Marple?" She offered a small smile. "A few things, small in themselves, but patterns tend to grow from small beginnings." Lucy shifted nervously. The verger clasped his hands tighter. "Mrs." Clement scribbled a date at the top of her paper, though no one had asked her to. Miss Marple began in her calm, measured tone. "There are two coats involved," she said. "One old, one new, one belonging to the verger, and one imitating his." The verger blinked, startled. I've not lost mine," he stammered. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but someone borrowed the appearance of it. A shorter version, newer stitching, seen behind the vicarage last night." Constable Pork frowned. "You mean disguise, ma'am?" "Of a kind," she replied. "Useful for approaching a man who trusted authority." A soft murmur rippled across the group. She continued. "There are also two brothers, Alfred Penrose and Thomas Penrose. Their past is not unknown. Theft, falsified accounts, a quarrel that ended their partnership, and Thomas vanished. Until now." Lucy paled again. Mrs. Clement's pen froze mid-scribble. Miss Marple tapped her knitting needles lightly. "And we have signals," she added. "Musical ones. A circled note in red. An old method the brothers used privately. A reminder, or a warning." Colonel Bantry coughed. By Jove. You think the brother returned? Miss Marple lowered her eyes briefly. I think Alfred expected him. I think Alfred feared him. And I believe the confrontation behind the church last night was not their first. Constable Pork rubbed his chin. But the key, ma'am? The missing vestry key? Miss Marple looked at the verger gently. You replaced it recently, did you not? The verger nodded. Yes. Misplaced a week ago. Thought I'd dropped it. It wasn't misplaced, Miss Marple said softly. It was taken. A stillness fell, a hush deep enough to hear the kettle warming in the corner. 2 coats, she repeated. 2 brothers. Old theft returning to claim its due. Secret signals. A meeting by night. Movements that do not match alibis. Her eyes lifted, steady and knowing. And someone here knows more than they have said. The room held its breath. A gentle, waiting silence. Patterns. Tightening. Truth drawing near. The small group remained silent as Miss Marple laid her knitting down, smoothing the wool with careful fingers. Her voice, when it came, was gentle, not accusing, not dramatic, simply steady. The voice of a woman who had spent a lifetime understanding how human hearts bend under pressure. I believe, she began quietly, that Thomas Penrose has returned to Street Mary Mead. Lucy gasped. Mrs. Clement's pen fell to the table. The verger shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Constable Pork straightened as though bracing for cold air. Miss Marple continued, her tone even and warm. Alfred hoped his brother would never come back, and yet part of him expected it. He watched the door last night, not out of habit but out of worry. The circled music note was not random. It was a signal, an old code between the two of them, used long before their quarrel divided them. She folded her hands. Thomas came to him wearing a borrowed symbol of authority, a verger's coat, not the real one, a shorter, newer imitation, enough to approach Alfred without alarming the villagers. The verger looked down in shame, though he had done nothing wrong. Human guilt often wandered toward innocent shoulders. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Thomas threatened Alfred. He wanted money, leverage, silence. Old crimes have long shadows, and guilt does not fade simply because years have passed. Alfred refused him, I believe. Refused to be drawn back into deceit he had worked so hard to leave behind. Mrs. Clement whispered. So they fought? Miss Marple nodded gently. Yes, behind the church. Lucy heard their voices. A promise broken, a past returning. And Alfred, who had already been frightened by Thomas's arrival, tried to stand his ground. She paused, allowing the warmth in her voice to smooth the edges of the truth. They struggled near the woodshed. The drag marks show it, the torn sleeve, the abandoned coat, and the scattered music folder inside the shed dropped in haste as Alfred tried to defend himself or call for help. Constable Pork frowned. So Thomas meant to kill him? Miss Marple shook her head slowly, kindly. No, fear drove his actions, not intent. I do not believe Thomas wished his brother dead. I believe he panicked during the struggle. Perhaps Alfred fell. Perhaps he struck his head. Perhaps Thomas ran, believing Alfred would recover, believing that if he fled quickly the village would never connect the two of them. Her eyes lowered. But Alfred did not survive. Winter air is unforgiving, and injury, left in the cold, becomes something far more dangerous. A long silence followed. No anger, just sadness. A quiet acknowledgement that tragedy often arrives through small, desperate choices rather than villainy. Miss Marple lifted her knitting once more, fingers brushing the wool. Fear makes strange things of people, she said softly. The words drifted. Across the room like warm breath on winter glass, gentle, human, undeniably true. And for a moment, the hall held only the weight of understanding. The news moved through street. Mary Mead with a quiet heaviness, like a slow drifting of winter fog. Villagers walked softer, voices lowered. The church bells seemed to ring with a more subdued echo, as though even it sensed the village had lost something fragile and human in the cold. Alfred Penrose's death was not spoken of loudly. No one wanted to disturb the hush that followed tragedy. Even those who had gossiped most eagerly the night before now carried their words with caution, like delicate china that might crack if handled too firmly. Lucy was the most affected. She kept to the back pew during choir practice, shawl drawn close, eyes swollen from quiet tears she tried to hide. She approached Miss Marple once, faltering in her steps. "I should have said something sooner," she whispered. "If I hadn't been afraid. If I'd spoken up last night, maybe he wouldn't." Her voice broke. Miss Marple placed a warm hand over Lucy's trembling one. "We all fear the wrong things at the wrong times," she said gently. "Courage rarely arrives when we expect it, and grief must never be built on imagined responsibility." Lucy cried softly then, small, fragile sobs that seemed almost apologetic. Miss Marple let her cry. Silence was often the kindest company. Mrs. Clement, determined not to let sorrow extinguish the choir's spirit, gathered the singers with gentle firmness. "We must honor him," she said softly. "He led us with care. We will sing for him." And so the choir reformed, tentative at first, hesitant, but slowly, steadily, the voices rose again. Not strong yet, not certain, but together. The verger, shaken by how easily someone had slipped into the church's quiet corners, reinforced every lock on the old doors. He polished the brass handles, checked the hinges, twice, tried to convince himself that safety could be rebuilt with tools and careful work. But his eyes carried a deeper worry, the realization that sacred places were not immune to human shadows. Through all of this, Miss Marple returned to her small cottage at the end of the lane. A soft fire crackled in the hearth. The kettle hummed its familiar tune. She settled into her chair with her knitting, the wool warm against her lap. Evening light drifted through the lace curtains, thin and pale. She did not think of guilt or blame. She thought of two brothers, of a past that tried so hard to stay hidden, of a village that, without knowing it, had become the stage for an old story seeking its final line. Her needles moved slowly, calm, steady, comforting, and as a fresh flurry of snow pressed gently against the window panes, a quiet truth settled into her thoughts, soft, certain, and entirely unhurried. Truth, even buried for years, rises gently when winter is darkest. Davis returned gently, his voice soft as the winter light settling over the village. "Tonight's mystery carried a quiet weight," he said. "That little circled music note, and that torn sleeve on the churchyard gate. They told their story long before anyone realized it." He paused, as though stirring a warm cup beside him. Sometimes old promises echo louder than new ones, and sometimes the truth waits years before stepping into the lantern glow. He let the thought settle, calm and unhurried. Then he asked with his usual kindness, "Which clue stood out to you first? And what moment felt the most mysterious tonight?" He thanked everyone listening, those wrapped in blankets, those walking home, those sitting in quiet rooms with a warm lamp nearby. "Your company," he said, "is what brings these winter nights to life." Then his voice lowered into that familiar closing cadence. "Truth," he whispered, cooled slower than tea. A gentle silence followed, the kind that wraps itself around a room like a soft shawl. And then, with a cozy promise for tomorrow. "Tomorrow, another kettle will boil." The lamps dim softly, and Davis's voice returns in a quiet whisper, warm, close, almost secret. "Tonight's story leaves the village resting," he murmurs. "But winter has a way of stirring new questions just beneath the calm." A faint rustle, a soft breath. Then the tease unfolds like a shadow slipping across a lamplit room. One quiet desk drawer, one unopened envelope, one truth waiting in the dust. He lets each image linger, gentle but intriguing, barely brushing the edge of mystery. "It begins with something small," he adds, as it often does. A forgotten piece of paper, a drawer that sticks just slightly, and a secret someone meant never to be found. The whisper deepens, warm as a closing door on a winter night. Rest well, dear friends. The next tale is already waking, and the moment fades, leaving only soft, simmering suspense. Snow drifts softly over Street Mary Mead, settling on rooftops, hedges, and the narrow lane leading away from the church hall. The choir lanterns glow faintly in the windows, their warm light flickering like distant stars. Miss Marple walks home through the cold, her shawl gathered close, her steps measured and calm against the quiet winter night. Behind her, the village rests still processing the truth gently revealed. A small sheet of music slips loose from someone's forgotten folder. It drifts across the path, turning once, twice, before settling in the snow, waiting for morning eyes to find it. Thank you, dear friends, for ending the evening here with us in Street Mary Mead. Your presence brings warmth to every winter tale, and your quiet companionship carries these stories farther than you know. In every home, every lane, every listening place, kindness between neighbors remains the truest comfort. May tonight's mystery settle gently, like snow on a still doorstep. Until we meet again, rest well, stay warm, and keep a little curiosity lit. Soft music hums beneath the fading evening. The fire glows warm, steady, comforting. A page turns somewhere gently. Miss Marple's silhouette appears in her cottage window, quiet against the winter night, and a final whisper drifts through the snow. Winter keeps its secrets, but only for a while.